The ballroom froze. It was not the music that faltered, nor the candlelight that guttered in its sconces, but the collective breath of society itself. Hundreds of glittering eyes stared, mouths half open, as the Duke of Blackwood, returned at last after years of absence and speculation, strode into the center of the floor. He wore no servant's livery now. The jewels of his rank gleamed at his throat and sword hilt, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of his house, his estate, his duty. And yet, when he extended his hand, it was not to the celebrated diamond of the season. It was to her. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. The forgotten sister who lingered in corners. The one draped in gowns a season out of fashion. The one whose sharp tongue was reserved for the shadows where no one thought to listen. Gasps rippled like a storm-tossed sea. Fans snapped shut with indignation. Clarissa Whitcomb, radiant, furious, and suddenly dethroned, swayed as though she might faint. The Duke's voice, deep and steady, cut through the scandalized silence. "Society may not see her," he said, his dark gaze locked only on Eleanor, "but I do. And she is mine." Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. She could not breathe for the weight of every gaze upon her. She could not think for the heat of his hand clasping hers. And she could not flee, though her heart screamed to. How had it come to this? How had the invisible sister, the one destined to remain unchosen, become the center of London's most shocking revelation? The answer lay in shadows, in secrets, in laughter stolen where no one was meant to hear. The answer began weeks earlier, on a night when she never once expected to be noticed. Weeks earlier. The Whitcomb estate was ablaze with preparation. Candles lit corridors from cellar to rooftop, footmen hurried with trays, maids darted with gowns, and Clarissa, golden, perfect Clarissa, swept through it all as though she commanded the very heavens. Eleanor followed in her wake like a shadow cast by brilliance. "Do stop slouching," Clarissa muttered without turning, eyes fixed upon her own reflection in the gilt mirror of the drawing-room. "You look positively invisible when you shrink so." "I thought that was the point," Eleanor replied softly, hands clasped at her waist. Clarissa's painted lips curved into a smile. "Precisely. Let us not forget your role, dearest. Tonight, all eyes will be upon me. You must simply not exist." Eleanor bit back the sting, as she always did. It was not malice, she told herself, only truth. Clarissa was destined for brilliance. Eleanor had been raised to manage the quiet margins. And tonight was no ordinary gathering. It was the beginning of the season. More than that, whispers had travelled faster than the carriages that bore them. The Duke of Blackwood had returned. He had been gone so long Eleanor could barely recall the face from childhood rumour. Some claimed he had been serving the crown in distant lands. Others whispered of duels, of banishments, of scandals hushed with money and blood. But one fact was constant. He was the most sought-after bachelor in England, and Clarissa was certain he would be hers. The ballroom. By the time Eleanor descended the grand staircase, the air already shimmered with perfume and candle smoke. Crystal chandeliers rained light upon gowns of satin and jewels that caught every spark. Laughter spilled like champagne, brittle and sweet, as ladies fanned themselves and gentlemen preened in their uniforms. And there, towering above them all, Clarissa gleamed in silver silk, her hair threaded with diamonds. She was every inch the diamond of the season, dazzling enough to blind. Eleanor wore pale blue. Not unfashionable, but not remarkable either. She did not mind. She had long ago grown accustomed to her place on the edges, where one might observe without being observed. Yet as she took her corner, a curious sensation prickled at her neck, the weight of a gaze. She turned. A servant stood at the far end of the hall, half hidden behind a pillar. His livery was plain, his posture disciplined. Yet there was something in the way he watched, not with boredom, not with subservience, but with the quiet intensity of one who measured every soul before him. Eleanor's brow furrowed. A strange servant, to study the ballroom as though it were his battlefield. And stranger still, when Clarissa swept past him with a careless flick of her hand, he neither bowed nor looked away. His gaze lingered on Eleanor instead. She quickly dropped her eyes, cheeks warming. It must be a trick of her imagination. No servant would dare. Whispers and whine. The hours spun on in a whirl of music and chatter. Eleanor endured the polite neglect of suitors who circled her sister. She listened to endless flattery, to whispers of fortune and land, to Clarissa's light laughter. Until, at last, she escaped to the edge of the refreshment table, desperate for a moment's reprieve. There, as she reached for a glass of wine, her elbow knocked another hand. Oh! She turned swiftly, and found herself staring into the steady gaze of the very same servant. The wine sloshed dangerously. "I beg your pardon," she said quickly. He inclined his head with unexpected grace. "No apology required, my lady." His voice was low, warm, not the rough accent of a servant but something controlled, commanding. Her brows knit. You speak rather well for a footman." A corner of his mouth curved. "And you observe rather more than most ladies I have encountered tonight." Eleanor blinked. Had he just teased her? Before she could gather her wits, Clarissa's voice chimed from across the hall. "Eleanor, do stop lingering in corners. Honestly, one would think you mean to vanish." Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks. She turned back, but the servant was already gone, melted into the throng as though he had never been there. And yet his voice lingered, curling through her mind like smoke. The seeds of suspicion. Over the next week, Eleanor noticed him everywhere. In drawing rooms, at teas, on the fringes of gatherings where Clarissa sparkled brightest. Always silent, always observing. And somehow, always near her. Once, she whispered a sardonic remark to a bored cousin about the endless parade of peacocks strutting through the ballroom. She had not expected anyone to hear. But across the room, she saw the servant's lips twitch, the ghost of a smile. Another evening, she stumbled while dancing with a pompous lord. Mortified, she fled to the terrace, only to find the servant already there, steadying a tray. He offered her a glass of water with a gentleness that unstrung her. "Are you in the habit," she asked breathlessly, "of appearing wherever I happen to embarrass myself?" His dark eyes gleamed with something almost like amusement. "Perhaps I am." Her heart stuttered. The scandalous scheme. But while Eleanor's awareness grew sharper, Clarissa's ambitions soared higher. Late one evening, Eleanor paused outside her sister's chamber, drawn by the murmur of voices. She should have turned away. She did not. "The Duke is already mine," Clarissa whispered. "He has no choice. Once the announcement is made, our family will rise beyond reproach. I care nothing for his affections, only his title." Eleanor's breath caught. Her chest tightened. Was this what marriage meant to Clarissa? A crown to polish, not a heart to cherish? She slipped back down the corridor, pulse racing. The words seared into her mind. And when she reached the stairwell, she found the servant waiting in the shadows. "You heard her," he said quietly, eyes locked on hers. Eleanor's heart jolted. "How do you?" "I hear everything." His tone was heavy, filled with a meaning she could not grasp. But when his gaze softened, when he looked at her as though she alone mattered in a world of glittering masks, Eleanor felt the strangest sensation, as though she had been seen for the very first time. That night, as Eleanor lay awake in her chamber, the questions spun endlessly. Who was he, this servant who spoke like a lord? Why did he linger near her instead of Clarissa? And why, when he looked at her, did her heart race with both fear and something far more dangerous? She did not yet know the truth, that the servant was no servant at all. That her fate, and all of London's whispers, would soon turn upon his choice. But she knew this, something had begun. And nothing in her quiet, invisible world would ever be the same again. Eleanor had always believed invisibility to be her gift. While Clarissa drew eyes with every flick of her fan, Eleanor passed unmarked, listening, observing, storing away truths no one thought to hide in her presence. But now, with every passing day of the season, she felt a new weight pressing against her, the gaze of the servant who was not quite a servant. The dance of shadows. At the Marchmorn ball, Clarissa glittered in emerald silk, her laughter loud enough to command attention from 3 suitors at once. Their compliments fell like jewels at her feet. Eleanor lingered near the orchestra, where candlelight flickered across gilded instruments. She tried to lose herself in the music, but the melody tangled with something more, the sensation of being watched. When she glanced across the floor, there he was again. Balancing a tray of champagne flutes with impeccable precision, his dark gaze lingered not on Clarissa, nor the duchesses who waved him down, but on Eleanor herself. Her heart gave a treacherous leap. She tilted her chin, whispering to herself, "I must be mad." "Madness," said a low voice just behind her, "can be a blessing, if it spares one from boredom." Eleanor started, whirling to find him at her elbow, offering a flute of champagne. "You," she breathed. "Me," he replied simply, a flicker of humor in his eyes. Her lips parted, torn between indignation and intrigue. "Do you always appear without invitation?" His mouth curved. "Only when necessary." "And what necessity compels you now?" He inclined his head toward her sister, who was twirling in the arms of a marquis. "You looked as though you required rescuing from the spectacle." Eleanor choked on a laugh, then quickly bit her lip. It was improper, scandalous, even, to jest at her sister's expense. And yet, the warmth bubbling in her chest was impossible to smother. "You ought not to say such things," she whispered. "Then perhaps," he murmured, leaning just close enough for only her to hear, "you ought not to laugh at them." Heat surged into her cheeks. She looked away, clutching the champagne flute as though it could steady her. Clarissa's warning. Later that night, as the Whitcomb carriage rattled back through fog-draped streets, Clarissa preened in her seat opposite. "The Duke's announcement must be near," she said, inspecting her nails. "He lingers too often in my company to deny it. Did you see how Lord Wetherby blushed when I laughed at his compliment? I dare say half of London is already resigned to my triumph." Eleanor said nothing. Clarissa's eyes flicked to her, sharp as glass. "You were smiling rather too freely this evening, sister. I hope you are not giving gentlemen the wrong impression. It would be disastrous if your plainness were mistaken for availability. We cannot afford such humiliation." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "I assure you, no one mistook me for anything of consequence." Clarissa's smirk was soft, cruel. "Good. Keep it so." The unexpected encounter. The following afternoon brought a garden party at Lord Ashcombe's estate. Ladies paraded beneath rose-draped arches, their gowns gleaming in sunlight, while gentlemen postured near the fountain. Eleanor drifted toward the shaded edges, inhaling the scent of lilacs. She thought herself blessedly alone until a voice behind her said, "Your sister has already declared the roses inferior. Shall I mark it in my ledger of her many grievances?" Eleanor turned sharply. The servant stood there, carrying no tray this time, only a folded cloth draped over his arm. She raised a brow. "Do you take notes on all of London's flowers?" "Only the ones your sister condemns." His mouth twitched. "At this rate, I shall be forced to record every garden from here to Cornwall." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound startled even herself. Bright, unrestrained, utterly unladylike. He stilled, as though the sound pierced something long dormant in him. Eleanor pressed a hand to her lips. "Forgive me. That was ill-mannered." "On the contrary," he said softly, "it was honest." Her gaze met his, and for an instant, the world hushed, no chatter of ladies, no clink of teacups, only the charged silence between them. Eleanor's breath caught. And then Clarissa's voice shattered it. "Eleanor, do stop skulking. Lord Harbury wishes to escort me to the fountain." The spell broke. Eleanor stepped back, curtsying stiffly. The servant inclined his head with calm composure, yet his eyes lingered a fraction longer before he turned away. The weight of observation. That evening, Eleanor sat before her dressing mirror, fingers tracing the worn lace at her sleeves. Her maid, Anna, hummed softly as she brushed Eleanor's hair. "Do you believe," Eleanor murmured, "that some people are born to be seen, while others are destined to fade into the background?" Anna paused. "I believe, my lady, that even shadows have their watchers." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" The maid's smile was secretive. "Nothing at all, miss. Only, I have noticed eyes upon you, where others do not." Heat prickled Eleanor's skin. She dismissed Anna quickly, but the words clung like burrs. Adrian's burden. Across the city, in a discreet lodging far from prying eyes, Adrian Blackwood stripped the livery from his shoulders. The plain cloth fell away, revealing the fine cut of his true attire beneath. He stared into the mirror, seeing not the servant the world mistook him for, but the Duke no one recognized. Duty pressed heavy on his chest. Clarissa Whitcomb, beautiful, admired, advantageous, was meant to be his bride. Their union would secure alliances, silence questions, and satisfy society's ravenous appetite for spectacle. And yet, every time he looked upon Eleanor, something within him stirred. Her wit, her laughter, her unstudied honesty, they ignited his soul in ways he had not felt since boyhood. But what right had he to desire her? To pull her into scandal? To brand her with his rebellion? He closed his eyes, jaw tight. He had returned to do his duty. But already, duty was unraveling. The servant's test. Days later, at a musicale hosted by Lady Penworth, Adrian found himself once again drifting near Eleanor. She sat at the edge of the hall, half hidden behind a column, while Clarissa soaked applause for her performance on the pianoforte. Eleanor's expression was distant, wistful, not fond of sonatas. Adrian murmured, appearing at her side with a tray of sugared almonds. She startled. "You must cease appearing like a spectre." "Perhaps I am one," he teased. Her lips twitched despite herself. "If so, you are most irritating phantom." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And yet you smile when I haunt you." Her cheeks warmed. She looked away, but not before he caught the flicker of a smile she tried to hide. For a moment, Adrian let himself simply watch her, the way candlelight softened her features, the intelligence in her eyes, the subtle curve of her mouth when she fought laughter. And he knew with aching certainty, it was too late. His heart had chosen. By the time the music ended, Eleanor had convinced herself she imagined it. The weight of his gaze, the electricity in his words, the warmth that lingered in her chest. But as she rose to follow Clarissa into the night, a single thought clung stubbornly to her mind. This was no ordinary servant. And if her instincts were right, his secrets might unravel everything she thought she knew about duty, family, and desire. The air inside Lady Harwood's ballroom shimmered with perfume and heat. Scores of dancers whirled in elaborate figures, skirts swishing, jewels flashing like sparks caught in candlelight. Eleanor stood at the edge of it all, her hands clasped tight before her, determined to remain unnoticed. She had perfected the art of fading into the wallpaper. Yet lately, it felt as though she carried a beacon on her shoulders, for every time she tried to disappear, his gaze found her. The servant who was not truly a servant. The spark. She had sought refuge at the refreshment table, desperate to escape the press of conversation. Reaching for a glass, she once again collided with him. "I am beginning to suspect," Eleanor murmured, steadying herself, "that you haunt refreshment tables solely to torment me." His lips curved faintly. "And if I confessed it to be true, then I should call you impertinent. And still you would not walk away." Her breath caught. For he was right. She did not walk away. Instead, she found herself lingering, caught by the quiet amusement in his dark eyes. They glinted with some hidden knowledge, some weight he carried and concealed behind his mask of service. Clarissa's charade. Eleanor. Clarissa's voice cut across the room like a whip. She swept toward them, gown glittering like a waterfall of pearls. "Do stop loitering. You look dreadfully dull when you stand about with servants." The words pierced sharper than intended. Eleanor flushed scarlet, but the man beside her only inclined his head with perfect calm. "Forgive me, my lady," he said, though his eyes flickered to Eleanor as if in defiance. Clarissa looped her arm through Eleanor's and pulled her away. "Honestly," she whispered, "must you encourage them? It is bad enough that you are plain. You will ruin us both if you appear desperate." Eleanor bit down on the protest that rose in her throat. She swallowed it, as she always did. But when she glanced back, the servant was watching her. Not pitying. Not mocking. Watching, as though he alone saw through the cruel veil her sister wrapped around her. The revelation. Later that evening, Eleanor slipped from the ballroom to catch her breath. The air outside was cool, fragrant with roses. She pressed her palms to the stone balustrade, trying to steady herself. And then voices carried through the darkness. "He has no choice," Clarissa's tones purred. "Once the announcement is made, he will be bound to me. My family's fortune, his title, we shall be untouchable." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She leaned closer, peering through the vines. Clarissa stood in the garden below with Lady Penworth, her words sharp with ambition. "I care nothing for affection," Clarissa continued. "Love is a foolish girl's dream. Power is what matters. And I shall be Duchess of Blackwood before the month is out." Eleanor staggered back, heart thundering. Love meant nothing to her sister. The Duke, whoever he truly was, would be little more than a crown upon her head. The unmasking seed. "You should not be here." The voice came from the shadows. Eleanor whirled. The servant stood a few paces away, half lit by moonlight, his expression unreadable. "You heard her," he said softly. Eleanor's lips parted. "And you? Why do you lurk in gardens, listening where you should not?" His gaze held hers with unnerving steadiness. "Because truth hides where masks are worn. And I, my lady, am searching for truth." Her breath caught at the intensity of his tone. For an instant, she felt as though the world tilted, as though the man before her was more than he seemed, carrying secrets vast enough to swallow them both. But before she could speak again, he bowed and vanished into the shadows, leaving her trembling with questions. The bond grows. In the days that followed, Eleanor found herself haunted. By her sister's cold words. By her own insignificance. But most of all, by the servant whose eyes burned with truths unspoken. At a card party, she glimpsed him across the room, silently assisting guests. When their gazes met, it felt like a tether pulling taut. At a tea gathering, she murmured a dry remark about Lady Caraway's dreadful hat, only to see him stifle a smile as he passed by. At every event, he was there. Not Clarissa's courtiers, not society's endless parade, but him. And Eleanor realized, with dawning dread, that her heart was no longer her own. The first real fracture. It came during a masquerade. The chandeliers blazed, masks glittered, laughter rang wild. Eleanor, cloaked in pale blue satin, wandered the edge of the dance floor. And there he was, masked as well, but unmistakable in the way he moved. She found herself drawn to him as though by fate. "You should not linger near me," she whispered when they found themselves side by side in the shadows. "Then why are you here?" His voice was velvet, low and dangerous. Her chest tightened. "Because I feel, as though you are the only one who truly sees me." Silence stretched. Then his gloved hand brushed hers, just a fleeting touch, but enough to send fire through her veins. He leaned closer. "Careful, my lady. Some truths are not meant to be spoken." Before she could reply, Clarissa appeared, radiant and smug, her mask of silver feathers gleaming. She seized Eleanor's arm, dragging her away. But not before Eleanor heard his parting words, murmured low enough for only her. "Trust your instincts, Lady Eleanor. They will not fail you." That night, long after the masquerade ended, Eleanor lay awake in her chamber. Her mind replayed every word, every glance, every brush of his hand. She knew now with unshakable certainty, this was no ordinary servant. But who was he? And what would happen when his true identity collided with the web of lies and expectations Clarissa spun so easily? The answer hovered just beyond reach, like a storm building on the horizon. And Eleanor's heart, foolish, fragile thing, whispered that when it broke, it would not be into silence but into fire. The days that followed the masquerade burned with a strange new awareness. Eleanor told herself she would ignore him, that she would not allow her heart to wander into foolish dreams. Yet wherever she went, he was there. And wherever he was, her pulse betrayed her. A banter in the garden. It was at Lady Fletcher's afternoon fete, beneath a canopy of lilacs, that Eleanor's resolve shattered once more. She had wandered from the crowd, seeking quiet among the hedges, when a low voice startled her. "You appear determined to escape society, my lady. Do you not fear they will notice your absence?" Eleanor turned, finding him standing a few paces away, balancing a tray of lemonade. She lifted her chin. "No one notices me even when I am present." His eyes glinted. "That cannot be true. I, for one, notice." Her lips parted, then pressed into a line. "You ought not say such things." "And yet," he murmured, stepping closer, "I do." Her heart stumbled. She forced a laugh, brittle and sharp. "You are impertinent for a servant." "Perhaps," he said, leaning in as though confiding a secret, "I am not as obedient as I appear." Eleanor's breath hitched. Their gazes locked, hers wide with alarm, his steady, unflinching. Before she could reply, laughter carried from the lawn, breaking the spell. Eleanor turned swiftly, fleeing back toward the crowd, her pulse hammering like a drum. Clarissa's warning. That evening, as the Whitcomb carriage rattled toward home, Clarissa's eyes narrowed. "You were gone too long today," she said coolly. "I saw you lingering in the garden. With a servant." Eleanor froze. "It was nothing. I merely lost my way." Clarissa's laugh was sharp as glass. "You forget yourself, sister. You may be invisible to society, but not to me. If you embarrass us, if you dare to entangle yourself in scandal, I shall not forgive you." Eleanor swallowed hard, fingers twisting in her lap. She said nothing. But in the dark window's reflection, she saw her sister's eyes gleaming with suspicion. A dangerous nearness. At Lady Penworther's musicale 2 nights later, Eleanor tried her best to remain in the shadows. But when she slipped onto the terrace for air, she found him waiting, as though fate itself conspired. "You should not seek me out," she whispered. "I do not seek," he replied softly. "I simply find you. Always." Her throat tightened. "And why is that?" He hesitated, then said, almost fiercely, "Because you are the only honest thing in this masquerade of a season." Silence pressed around them. Eleanor's heart pounded as though it might burst. She should have fled. Instead, she whispered, "You cannot say such things to me." "Why not?" His voice was low, roughened with something dangerous. "Because I wear livery? Because society demands you look past me?" Her lips parted. For a moment, she thought, hoped, he would reveal himself. But then he stepped back, masking his intensity with calm. "Forgive me, my lady. I overstepped." Eleanor's chest ached with the absence of his nearness. The seeds of suspicion. That night, Eleanor lay restless in her bed. Who was he, truly? His words, his bearing, the way he carried himself, they did not belong to a servant. And yet he kept the role with flawless discipline. Her mind spun with questions, but her heart whispered only one truth. When he looked at her, she felt alive. Clarissa's plot. Meanwhile, Clarissa's ambition sharpened into cruelty. At a breakfast gathering, she leaned across the table, voice low. "The Duke must announce soon," she said to their mother, her smile sweet as honey. It would be unthinkable to delay further. Imagine the scandal. Their mother beamed. "Indeed. You shall be Duchess before the season's end." Clarissa's gaze flicked to Eleanor. "As for you, dearest, Do not meddle where you are not wanted. You are a wallflower. Stay in the shadows where you belong. Eleanor's stomach twisted. But instead of silence, words slipped past her lips before she could stop them. Perhaps it is in shadows where one sees most clearly. Clarissa's smile faltered, then hardened. Careful, sister. Shadows are also where reputations rot. The slow burn spark. That evening, at a crowded ball, Eleanor found herself pressed against a column as dancers swirled past. Suddenly, a hand brushed hers, fleeting, deliberate. She looked up. It was him. "Dance with me," he murmured. Her heart lurched. "I cannot." "You can." His gaze burned into hers. "No one will notice. They never look at you, do they?" The words, though softly spoken, struck deep. For once, invisibility became a shield rather than a curse. He guided her onto the edge of the floor. They moved slowly, carefully, his hand steady against her back. No one looked twice. No one cared. And yet Eleanor felt as though the world had cracked open. Each step was a secret, each brush of fingers a vow unspoken. She could hardly breathe. When the music ended, he released her with aching reluctance. "Soon," he whispered. She wanted to ask, soon what? But he was gone again, leaving her trembling in the crowd. The next morning, gossip spread like wildfire. Lady Davenant had declared, with all the authority of her fluttering fan, that the Duke of Blackwood would announce his engagement at the upcoming Whitcomb ball. Clarissa preened. "At last," she said, eyes shining with triumph. "The title is mine." Eleanor's chest constricted. She told herself it was relief, that her sister would have everything she wanted. But in truth, her heart cried out in silent protest. And when she next caught the servant's gaze from across the hall, she saw the same storm mirrored in his eyes. The truth was no longer avoidable. Something had to break. The Whitcomb Gardens lay hushed beneath moonlight, perfumed with roses and cool with drifting fog. Music from the ballroom spilled faintly through the open doors, but here, in the shadows, the world was still. Eleanor pressed her palms against the balustrade, her chest tight. She had fled the crowd, unable to bear Clarissa's endless preening, unable to endure whispers that the Duke would announce his engagement within days. The Duke. The man she had never met. The man society clamored for. And yet, in her heart, she knew she had already met him. The confrontation. "You should not wander alone." The voice came from the shadows. Eleanor startled, spinning to find him there, the servant, the phantom who haunted her every step. Candlelight from the ballroom struck across his face, sharpening the lines of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. She exhaled shakily. "You again." "Always me," he murmured. Anger flared through her confusion. "Why do you follow me? Why do you linger in places no servant belongs?" He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Because you speak truths no one else dares." Her breath caught. "That is no answer." "Then demand the one you already suspect," he said softly. Her pulse thundered. "Who are you?" For a long moment, silence stretched. Then, with a slow, deliberate hand, he reached up and unpinned the crest of livery at his collar. The plain brass insignia fell away. Beneath it gleamed a signet ring, heavy, unmistakable. Eleanor's lips parted in shock. "No." He held her gaze, voice low and steady. "Yes. I am Adrian Blackwood. The Duke you have all been waiting to see." Eleanor's shock. Her knees threatened to give way. She clutched the balustrade, staring at him as though the very ground had split. "You, a duke?" The words scraped from her throat. "All this time, you deceived me." "I revealed myself to you," he corrected, eyes burning into hers. "More than I have to anyone else." Eleanor shook her head. "You let me speak freely. You let me laugh. You let me believe." "That you mattered," he said fiercely. Because you do. Her heart lurched painfully. And what of my sister? She parades herself before society, believing she is your bride. Adrian's jaw hardened. She will never be my bride. Shared vulnerability. Silence fell, taut and trembling. Eleanor's chest heaved with every ragged breath. I have been gone so long, Adrian said at last, his voice rough with confession. Years in distant lands, carrying a title that never felt like mine. I returned to do my duty. But when I looked upon your sister, when I heard her cruelty, I knew duty alone would damn me. He stepped closer, so near the warmth of him seemed to envelop her. And then there was you. The sister who hid in shadows. The one who laughed honestly, who spoke without fear. The one who saw me when no one else did. Her throat tightened. You should not say these things. And yet I must, he whispered. The first kiss. He reached for her hand, his touch searing. Eleanor, I do not care for diamonds polished for society's gaze. I care for the woman who ignites my soul. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. You will ruin us both. Then let ruin come, he said, voice low with hunger. Before she could stop herself, Eleanor swayed toward him. His hand lifted to her cheek, fingers trembling against her skin. And then his mouth was on hers. It was not the practiced kiss of a lord, nor the timid peck of a suitor. It was fire and desperation, gentleness laced with need. Eleanor gasped into it, clutching his coat as though she might drown. When he drew back, her heart was racing, her lips burning. This cannot be, she whispered. It already is, he answered. New stakes. The sound of footsteps in the distance jolted them apart. Laughter drifted from the ballroom, growing nearer. Adrian grasped her hand. Trust me, he urged. Whatever comes, trust me. Her eyes searched his, torn between terror and longing. And then Clarissa's voice rang through the garden, sharp as a blade. Eleanor, are you skulking again? Eleanor froze, panic crashing over her. Adrian's hand tightened on hers, but his expression shuttered back into calm. When Clarissa swept into view, Eleanor stood alone. The servant, no, the Duke, had vanished once more into the shadows. That night, Eleanor lay trembling in her bed, lips still tingling, heart still aflame. She knew the truth now. The servant was the Duke. The Duke was the man she could not stop longing for. And the moment his true identity reached society's ears, her world would ignite into scandal. The days after the kiss unfolded like a dream laced with dread. Every glance across a ballroom, every stolen moment when their eyes met, burned with a secret only they shared. Eleanor woke each morning with her lips tingling, her heart aching, as though she had carried fire into her bed. But beneath the warmth crept fear, for she knew the truth of it. What they had could not remain hidden. Clarissa noticed first. She always noticed. It was at the Montrose dinner, the air heavy with pheasant and port, laughter brittle as porcelain. Clarissa, seated at the center of the table like a queen, basked in admiration while Eleanor kept to the shadows as usual. Yet across the room, Adrian, dressed once more in plain livery, his disguise flawless to all but her, allowed his gaze to linger on Eleanor a fraction too long. Clarissa's eyes sharpened, her lips curving into a smile that was not sweet but cruel. Later, as they entered their carriage, she turned to Eleanor with a voice dipped in venom. You have been careless, sister. Eleanor stiffened. I do not know what you mean. Oh, but you do. Clarissa's eyes glittered in the dim light. Do you think me blind? I have seen the way that servant looks at you. Do not imagine you can ensnare him. Even if you could, what would you gain? A scandal? A ruined name? Nothing more. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Clarissa leaned close, her whisper sharp as a knife. You will not ruin this for me. Do you hear? The Duke is mine. He is promised, and by week's end, he will kneel before me. Eleanor stared at her sister, horrified not only by the malice in her voice but by the certainty. Clarissa believed she already owned him. And Eleanor, torn between truth and silence, could not summon the courage to speak. The next evening, the tension snapped. At Lord Armitage's ball, Eleanor was cornered by whispers. Lady Penworther's fan fluttered behind her painted lips, her voice low but carrying. Poor Miss Eleanor, so desperate she stoops to servants for attention. Heat seared Eleanor's cheeks. She turned to flee, only to find more murmurs following her, snatches of gossip blooming like weeds. I heard she lingered in gardens with one, caught nearly in an embrace. She pushed through the crowd, her breath shallow, and nearly collided with Adrian himself. For one brief moment, safety flooded her. His eyes softened, as though he might reach for her, steady her trembling. But then, under the watchful gaze of a dozen onlookers, his face hardened into cold civility. He bowed slightly, no more than he would to any other lady, and stepped back into the crowd without a word. The rejection sliced deeper than any insult. He was protecting her, she told herself desperately, but the hollow in her chest said otherwise. The days that followed were worse. Everywhere she turned, gossip hissed. The whispers Clarissa had planted grew into vines that strangled Eleanor's every breath. Suitors withdrew their attentions, matrons eyed her with disdain. Even her mother, once indulgent, now regarded her with cool disapproval. And Adrian was nowhere. When she saw him across a room, he avoided her gaze. When she slipped toward the terrace, he did not follow. It was as though their kiss, their confessions, had never happened. One afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows of the Whitcomb drawing room, Clarissa found her again. She circled Eleanor like a predator, her silk skirts whispering on the floor. "You see," she said softly, almost kindly, "he wants nothing to do with you. You have served your purpose, a distraction, perhaps, a fleeting amusement. But in the end, duty always wins. He will be mine." Eleanor's throat closed. "You know nothing of him." Clarissa's smile was sharp. "I know enough. I know he will never risk everything for you." The words burrowed deep, cruel and unshakable. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face as Clarissa swept from the room, leaving silence heavy behind her. That night, Eleanor dreamed of Adrian's hands, of his lips on hers, of the way his voice had trembled when he said she mattered. She woke with tears on her cheeks, her pillow damp with longing and despair. Days blurred. The city thrummed with excitement, carriages clattering faster, gossip spinning tighter, until at last the invitation arrived, a grand Whitcomb ball, hosted by her family, where all expected the Duke of Blackwood to make his long-awaited announcement. Clarissa glowed with triumph, her every movement rehearsed, her gown commissioned from the finest French seamstress. Their mother fussed endlessly, ensuring no detail would fall short of perfection. Eleanor stood at her mirror, pale and trembling, draped in a gown of soft lavender that seemed to mock her invisibility. She felt like a lamb led to slaughter, a silent witness to her own erasure. But as she stared into her reflection, she whispered into the silence, "I will not break." Still, when she descended the staircase into the blazing light of the ballroom, her strength faltered. Adrian was there, towering above the crowd, dressed at last not in livery but in the finery of his title. The Duke revealed. The man she had kissed in shadows, now every inch the noble everyone expected. Her heart soared, and plummeted in the same breath. For he stood beside Clarissa. The crowd murmured with delight, their whispers swelling into waves. Eleanor clutched the banister until her knuckles whitened, her chest so tight she could scarcely breathe. Clarissa beamed, radiant, her hand poised delicately on his sleeve. Adrian's face was carved from stone, unreadable, untouchable. He did not glance at Eleanor once. The music struck up, couples forming for the first dance. Adrian led Clarissa forward, their figures gleaming beneath the chandeliers. The crowd erupted in applause. Eleanor's vision blurred. Her heart cracked with each step he took beside her sister. She wanted to flee, to bury herself where no one could see her tears, but her feet were rooted to the marble floor. The night spun on in a blur of music and laughter that cut like knives. Eleanor endured the gazes, the whispers, the pitying smiles. She endured the sight of Adrian's hand guiding Clarissa across the floor, endured the roaring silence of being unseen. When at last she escaped to the balcony, the city stretched before her, cold and endless. She pressed her hands to her face and let silent sobs shake her shoulders. She had believed his words. She had believed his kiss. And now, as the night unfurled in glittering cruelty, she believed she had been a fool. Inside, Clarissa's laughter rang triumphant. And Eleanor whispered into the dark, "He will never choose me." The night after the Whitcomb ball, the household buzzed with victory. Clarissa paraded through the corridors like a queen already crowned, accepting congratulations and basking in whispers that the Duke's announcement was inevitable. Their mother beamed, their father glowed with pride. The entire house seemed to pulse with triumph. But Eleanor felt hollow. She lingered in her chamber, staring at the pale light of dawn creeping through the curtains. Her heart ached with every memory, his hand brushing hers, his voice confessing he saw her when no one else did, the fire of his kiss. She had believed him. And yet he had stood beside Clarissa, cold and unyielding, his silence a blade sharper than any words. For hours, she wept quietly into her pillow. But as the day stretched on, something inside her shifted. She was weary of shadows. Weary of being told she was invisible. Weary of silencing herself so that others might shine. Clarissa might hold the crowd's gaze, but Eleanor still had her own truth, and she would not let it be stolen from her. 2 nights later, at Lady Devonshire's musicale, Eleanor found herself alone in the conservatory. The scent of orchids hung heavy in the air, the soft strains of music drifting faintly from the hall. She pressed trembling fingers to her bodice, whispering into the silence, "I will not be invisible." A voice answered from the shadows, "Then let me see you." Her breath caught. She turned, and there he was. No livery, no disguise, but not the untouchable Duke either. His coat was undone, his cravat loose, his eyes fierce with something raw and unguarded. "Adrian," she whispered. He crossed the room in 3 strides, seizing her hands. "Forgive me," he said hoarsely. "I tried to stay away. I told myself it was duty, honor, the weight of 1,000 expectations. But every moment without you has been torment. I cannot breathe unless I am near you." Eleanor's tears spilled freely. "And yet you stood beside her. You let them believe." "Because if I chose you then," he cut in, "they would have torn you apart before I could protect you. I thought distance would keep you safe. But I was wrong. All I did was wound you deeper." She shook her head, her sob caught between grief and relief. "You will ruin us both, Adrian." "Then let ruin come," he whispered, just as he had the night of their kiss. And before she could protest, his lips were on hers again, fiercer this time, desperate, as though he would brand his soul into hers. Eleanor clung to him, her heart breaking and mending in the same breath. When they parted, gasping, she touched his cheek. "If you mean this, if you truly mean this, then you must stand by me. Not in shadows. Not in secret. Before them all." Adrian's jaw clenched, his eyes burning. "I will." The words trembled between them, a vow spoken into the orchid-scented dark. But fate did not grant them peace. As Eleanor slipped back into the ballroom, her sister's eyes followed her, sharp, calculating. Clarissa's lips curled in a smile that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She knew something. Perhaps she had seen the hurried smoothing of Eleanor's gown, the faint flush in her cheeks. Or perhaps it was the way Adrian's gaze flickered too often toward Eleanor, his composure fraying at the edges. Either way, Clarissa was watching. And Eleanor knew, with chilling certainty, that the time for shadows was ending. The gossip grew louder in the days that followed. Lady Penworth whispered that the Duke would make his declaration at the next Whitcomb ball. Invitations spread across London like wildfire. The ton prepared for spectacle, for triumph, for scandal. Clarissa preened before her mirror, certain of her victory. When Adrian Blackwood kneels before me, she said, her voice gleaming with arrogance, the world will finally see me as I deserve. Eleanor sat silent by the window, her heart steady now, no longer trembling with invisibility. For she knew a secret Clarissa did not. Adrian had already chosen. And if he kept his vow, if he dared defy them all, the world would see Eleanor at last. The Whitcomb ball blazed brighter than any London had seen that season. Crystal chandeliers flung prisms of light across marble floors, the air thick with perfume, heat, and the hum of whispers. It was to be the night of triumph. Everyone knew it. The Duke of Blackwood would finally make his long-awaited declaration. Clarissa Whitcomb would be Duchess before the night was through. Clarissa glided among her guests like a sovereign, her gown of white satin threaded with pearls that gleamed like captured stars. She smiled until her cheeks ached, drank in the envy that followed her. Every eye was hers. Eleanor, draped in soft lavender, lingered at the edge as always. Yet her chest no longer ached with invisibility. Her heart was steady, her resolve firm. Adrian had sworn to her in secret, "I will." Tonight, she would learn if he meant it. The air shifted when he entered. Adrian Blackwood, no longer in livery, no longer a ghost in shadows, but every inch the Duke. His coat gleamed with midnight embroidery, his shoulders broad and commanding, his presence a storm contained within human form. Conversations faltered. Fans stilled mid-flutter. The crowd turned as one, bowing, curtsying, drinking in the sight of the man they had waited years to see unveiled. Clarissa's eyes shone with triumph. She swept forward, her hand extended delicately. "Your Grace," she purred, her voice rich with anticipation. "London awaits your words." Adrian's gaze swept past her, and landed on Eleanor. The ballroom hushed. Eleanor's heart thundered against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. He moved forward, not toward Clarissa, but toward her, every step reverberating through the stunned silence. Gasps rippled as he stopped before Eleanor, his dark eyes never wavering. He extended his hand. "Lady Eleanor Whitcomb," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, steady and sure, "it is you I choose. Before them all, I claim you as mine." The world erupted. Fans snapped shut like whips. Gentlemen muttered in outrage. Ladies clutched at pearls, whispering furiously. Clarissa's face drained of color, then flamed red with humiliation. "You cannot be serious," she hissed, stepping forward. "She is nothing, a wallflower, a shadow. I am the diamond. I am the one promised." Adrian turned, his voice cutting like steel. "You were promised nothing. And I will not bind myself to vanity when truth stands before me." He looked back at Eleanor, his hand still extended, his eyes burning with devotion. "You are the one who saw me. The one who spoke with honesty when all others drowned in flattery. You are the only woman I would risk everything for." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. Her hand trembled as she lifted it to his. Clarissa let out a strangled cry. "You will ruin us all. She is unworthy." Adrian drew Eleanor closer, his gaze hard as he faced the crowd. "Then let ruin come. I would rather walk through fire with her than live in gilded emptiness with anyone else." The ballroom, once a storm of whispers, fell into stunned silence. No one dared speak. And then, as though society itself bent under the weight of defiance, a few hands began to clap. Slowly at first, then swelling, until applause rippled like thunder across the hall. Adrian pulled Eleanor into his arms, kissing her before them all. The crowd gasped anew, scandal and or entwined, but no one could deny the power of it. The Duke had chosen, and his choice was irrevocable. Eleanor melted into him, her tears mingling with laughter, her heart blazing with joy. For the first time, she was not invisible. She was seen, cherished, claimed, not by duty, but by love. Clarissa fled the hall in fury, her triumph shattered. The gossip that would follow her would sting for years, but Eleanor scarcely heard it. All she knew was Adrian's arms around her, his lips sealing their vow, and the roaring certainty that her life had changed forever. Tonight, scandal had become salvation. And Eleanor Whitcomb, once the forgotten sister, now stood at the center of London's greatest story. The days after the Whitcomb ball unfolded like a tempest. Gossip sheets flew through London like sparks on the wind. "The Duke chooses the wrong sister," cried one. "From wallflower to duchess, scandal or salvation?" asked another. Society had never seen such an upheaval, and every drawing-room trembled with speculation. But while the city whispered, Eleanor walked in a new world. For the first time in her life, eyes turned toward her. Not with pity, not with dismissal, but with wonder. She no longer lingered at the edges of gatherings. She was the gathering. And always at her side, Adrian, tall, steady, unyielding, his hand warm at her back, his gaze fierce with devotion. Clarissa raged, of course. She had locked herself in her chamber for 3 days, refusing meals, emerging only to unleash fury upon their mother. Yet even her wrath could not undo what the world had seen. The Duke had chosen, and his choice was irrevocable. Clarissa's name became a hiss of ridicule in gossip circles, her vanity exposed for all to mock. Eleanor did not rejoice in her sister's humiliation, but neither did she weep for it. She had wept enough in shadows. Now, she lifted her head high. 1 week later, Adrian brought her to Blackwood Manor. The great estate loomed like a fortress of stone and history, its halls echoing with power and memory. Eleanor trembled as she stepped across the threshold, the weight of her new life pressing against her shoulders. Would the servants mock her? Would his peers sneer? But when she looked up, Adrian was watching her, his eyes softened with warmth. "You belong here," he said simply. She drew a breath, and for the first time, believed it. Their betrothal was announced in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, where roses spilled across trellises and fountains whispered in the sunlight. The ton gasped, of course, but none dared defy the Duke's word. Adrian stood tall before them all, Eleanor's hand clasped firmly in his voice steady as he declared, "This is the woman I love. She is not merely worthy of me, she is my very soul." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, but she did not lower her head. She lifted it, proud, her voice carrying as she answered, "And I am his. Not because of his title, but because he is the man who saw me when no one else would." The crowd, scandalized and moved in equal measure, could only bow before the strength of it. That night, after the guests had gone, Eleanor wandered into the gardens alone, moonlight silvering her gown. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who faded into corners, whose laughter was smothered, whose worth was measured only by comparison to her sister. Then she felt arms wrap around her waist, steady and sure. Adrian pressed a kiss to her hair. "What are you thinking, my love?" he murmured. She turned in his embrace, her heart swelling. "That once, I was invisible. And now," she smiled through her tears, "now I am unforgettable." His eyes softened, his hand lifting to her cheek. "You always were. The world was simply too blind to see." Their lips met again, slow and reverent, sealing a vow stronger than scandal, stronger than duty. A vow of love freely chosen. Months later, their wedding bells rang across London. The cathedral gleamed with light, the pews packed with nobility and commoners alike, all desperate to witness the union that had rewritten the rules of courtship. Clarissa did not attend. She was already seeking fortune elsewhere, her name tarnished. But Eleanor did not think of her. She thought only of the man who stood waiting at the altar, his gaze steady, his love blazing for all to see. As she walked toward him, veiled in lace and trembling with joy, the whispers fell away. There was no room for gossip now, only the truth, that she was his, and he was hers, and together they had defied the world. When Adrian lifted her veil and kissed her beneath the vaulted arches, applause thundered, echoing like victory through the hall. Eleanor's tears shone as she whispered against his lips, "Once invisible, now yours forever." "And always mine," he answered, his voice breaking with love. In the years to come, they would be remembered not as scandal but as legend, the Duke who disguised himself to find truth, and the wallflower who became his duchess. Their love became the tale whispered in ballrooms, written in scandal sheets, celebrated in songs. But for Eleanor, it was simpler than all that. For when she lay beside Adrian in the quiet of their chamber, his arm heavy around her, his breath warm against her hair, she knew the truth that mattered most. She had been chosen. Not because of beauty, not because of status, but because she was herself, witty, kind, honest, unafraid. And she was loved. Forever. Would you risk scandal for true love? Tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed Eleanor and Adrian's story, don't forget to share it. Someone out there is waiting to be reminded that love can defy every rule.